Aloha kako. I'd also like to introduce Tom Eisen. He's joined us over Zoom, and he is head of the Environmental Review Program, ERP office, which is now in the Office of State Planning, or Office of Planning and Sustainable Development. So we'll
What are
go
we
into
called?
that a little bit in a minute, but I'm gonna have to turn because I don't have. There's Tom. Hi, Tom. Hey. So he was
Welcome.
nice enough. Yeah, he was nice enough to be able to join us just until 3, though. But we might be done sooner because we're kind of running early. So, which is good. Thanks, Tom. Okay, if we can start the slideshow. And there are some handouts on the table. So I'm going to hold them up as I get to that point. Okay, so we're going to be talking about Hawaii's program, which was modeled after NEPA. So you guys are like 3/4 of the way there already because you've just gotten the NEPA primer. Okay, so this is going to be the material we're going through this afternoon. We're going to talk about background, the admin rules that were revised recently, a couple of years ago. Something very important that we're going to be asking most of you to do is develop the project description. So you heard about how important that was for NEPA. Well, it's the same thing for HEPA. We can't evaluate a project until we have a complete project description. Then we're going to be talking about evaluating a project for compliance. Again, that goes along with what level of review is going to be needed. We always have a trigger because it's use of state lands. So you just have to assume, Chapter 343 applies. We have to do environmental review. And then we'll talk about timeline for completing an EA, again, best case scenario. Our exemption list, which is also what a lot of folks are going to be dealing with and interacting with the planning office on. And then last but not least, we're going to talk a little bit about coastal zone management in Chapter 343. So, okay, next slide. Okay, the law was passed in 1974, and it was patterned after NEPA, as I said. But the office was originally called the Office of Environmental Quality and Compliance, and then it was renamed and moved to the Office of Planning and Sustainable Development in 2021. They facilitate our environmental review process, known as HEPA, and they administer Chapter 343 and the administrative rules. So there's the link to their website down there at the bottom. So check it out. They have a lot of resources on their website, a lot of links. They have a compendium of all the past EAs and EISs, and they're organized by decade, by island. It's just a fabulous resource. I use it all the time. So, okay, next slide.
Could I add just a technicality?
Yes.
Okay, we were the Office of Environmental Quality Control. It was noted a little differently there, but that's a minor thing. It's in the past. And again, it's almost a nuance. It doesn't matter, but there technically is no Hawaii Environmental Policy Act. There is no HEPA, but the process is called HEPA in acknowledgement of NEPA and just to indicate the similarities and difference between that. But there really is no such thing as a Hawaii Environmental Policy Act. Chapter 343, which is the enabling statute, is not called Hawaii Environmental Policy Act. It's just called Environmental Impact Statements. Just technicalities, but just want to, sometimes words and details matter. So just want to get that out there.
Oh, thanks, Tom. No, that's really helpful. Yeah, it is the EIS law, even though what most of us deal with are EAs or EA exemptions. So thanks, Tom. I will make that correction for next year. So we have a few copies. I didn't print a lot because it's pretty long, but we have the Kepo'o v. Watson, which refers to our past and current chairman, Collie Watson. So this is what basically clarified at the Hawaii State Supreme Court that this law is applicable to Hawaiian homelands. It's an interesting read if you like case law and want to learn more about the special status of Hawaiian homelands. It does clarify some of those things, but it did establish that we are subject to the environmental review process. And that was in 1998. And it's because it is state land. The Hawaiian Homes Commission Act doesn't preempt state law, but it also doesn't conflict with the Hawaiian Homes Commission Act because it was enacted to protect public health, safety, and welfare, and it's essentially an information disclosure document. It's not regulatory in that sense, so I know Tom will tell us that ERP is advisory. They don't regulate agencies. It's really in the agency's ball court. But, you know, there are legal challenges and that sort of thing if people feel that the environmental review has been inadequate. There's lots of case law regarding that. So if you go into HRS Chapter 343, you can read a lot of that. So it's mainly to disclose information about potential impacts on the environment and also discuss mitigation measures, right? We talked about those with NEPA earlier. So, okay, next slide. And I don't have nice color and pictures. Ku'upu is inspiring me. I gotta work harder on my graphics, but lots of words. But so in 2019, the last time the administrative rules to implement HRS Chapter 343, it had last been updated in '96. So it was determined that a complete revamp was needed. So it was repealed in its entirety and replaced by Chapter 11-200.1. It was a 2-year-long administrative rules process. It was consolidated and reorganized. New sections were added that clarified requirements for computation of time. You know, a lot of the stuff that had caused problems over the years and the decades got fixed, basically. There was a lot of housekeeping, you know, republication, applicability, multiple or phased actions, use of prior environmental review documents, determining the level of environmental review needed, HEPA, NEPA, joint actions. We did talk about a little bit, Claudine did talk about that a little bit. And then the planning office did participate in the administrative rules revision process, and we did submit comments and attend public hearings. So, next slide. So the whole process was modernized. Previously, it required, you know, printed documents, and it just was really expensive. So now you can basically distribute PDFs electronically. You can submit your documents for publication online. There's a great process to do that on the website, very clear and easy to use, so that your documents can be published in the environmental notice, which comes out every 2 weeks. And so we have another handout, which is really handy. It is your 2024, so this comes out every year, your publication calendar for the Environmental Review Program Periodic Bulletin. And so that gives you the, you know, the submittal deadline for current rules, as well as 96, which I think that's kind of moot at this point, publication date, and then whether it's an EA or EISPN, there's a 30-day comment deadline. It gives you those dates, and then a 45-day deadline for an environmental impact statement. So
We still get a few
now,
stragglers under the old rules.
what? There are stragglers? Really? Wow.
Yep.
Okay. That's
Amazingly still, yes, that's why we
left it
maintain the
on there.
deadline, which is a little different. Yeah, at some point it's going to get, I think this year it'd be 5 years, and that's the end of the shadow period where it's possible to submit under the old rules.
Okay. All right. Good to know. Um, okay. So there's programmatic environmental review. I think Malia did talk about that a little bit with NEPA. And so we can also do that now under HEPA. It was kind of vague before, and now it's much more clearer about how to do that, when you can do that, whether you have a wide range of individual projects, implementation over a long time frame, or implementation across a large geographic area. And then also the EA exemption process was updated to allow two categories of actions. Ones that are anticipated to have little to no environmental impact, like NEPA, are considered de minimis, so that would have been like you're exempt under NEPA, but they're not the same, so you can't you substitute one for the other, and Claudine made that clear, they're different categories. So under under Chapter 343, you can create a two-part list. You have a bunch of actions that are categorized as de minimis, which is like negligible, and then the second is part 2, which is ones that you're actually going to have to do an EA exemption for. Okay, next slide. One of the two big changes that were made to the significance criteria regarding climate change. So looking at sea level rise has been added to the significance criterion number 11. So you have to evaluate proposed actions regarding the sea level rise exposure area, and state sea level rise exposure area maps should be included in EAs and EISs to demonstrate potential vulnerability of a proposed action. The significance criterion 13 was amended to also require agencies to consider whether a proposed project will emit substantial greenhouse gases at any stage or may emit substantial greenhouse gases as an indirect or cumulative impact. So this is ways that we are implementing, some of the state climate change laws that have been passed through the environmental review process. Okay, next slide. Okay, here's the biggie that I really want folks to, and I also, we'll be coming to we have the big flow chart, big scary flow charts today. So the one I want you to look at, which you might not have picked up, I just printed it out during lunch, was our, basically our information intake worksheet. So Andrew did these great forms for us, and we need to disseminate them more, make them more accessible. I think we're also going to be revising and updating them, but it gives you a good idea of what are the kinds of information that we need you to include when describing a project so that it can be evaluated to see if we can issue an EA exemption or if it needs an EA or even an EIS. So, basically we need to know everything. Whether it's equipment, or is something being constructed both above and below ground? Is there any ground disturbance? Will something be demolished? Will it modify the natural environment? Grading, filling, anything like that? Ongoing maintenance, technical studies that might be required. Is it only happening on Hawaiian homelands? Who will be implementing the project? And is there coordination with other agencies or organizations needed? And will it be located in a sensitive area or sensitive environment? That's a big one because it might be eligible for an exemption, let's say in Ho'olehua on Molokai, But if you're down in Kapa'akea and you're next to a wetland, then it might be a different story, or if you're on the shoreline. So, okay, next slide. All right, so when we're evaluating for environmental compliance, there's 4 steps with 3 levels of increasing complexity of review, public engagement, and approval. Determination of significance, we have to consider and evaluate the sum of effects of the proposed action on the quality of environment. And we have to determine the level of environmental review. The agency, through its judgment and experience, shall assess the significance of the potential impacts of the action to determine the level of environmental review necessary. If there's minimal or no significant effects, then it's eligible for exemption, and the agency prepares an exemption notice under subchapter 8. Next slide. If it's not consistent with the exemption classes, or if it's located in a sensitive environment, then it can't be exempted from preparation of an EA. If a finding of no significant impact is anticipated, a FONSI, then we prepare an EA. If you can't do an anticipative FONSI, then you need to prepare an EIS. And you can go straight to EIS too, and you have to do an EIS prep notice for that, called an EISPN. If significant impacts are anticipated or can't be mitigated below the level of significance, again, then you have to do an EIS. Next slide. All right, this is a slide from ERP. Tom was nice enough to send me one of his presentations, so I kind of cribbed some of that information. So these are some definitions. There's a lot of guidance on the ERP website. There's guidebooks, handbooks, the HAR, the administrative rules. It's all on their website. So if you want to know more, please go to that website and download that information. Where it got confusing before had to do with approving agency or accepting authority. So that was all clarified in this latest update to the administrative rules. DHHL normally is the proposing we are the proposing or determining agency. If it's our project, then we're proposing. If it's being proposed by someone else on Hawaiian Homelands, then we're determining. And then the action is a project, a discrete planned undertaking that is site and time specific, has a specific goal or purpose, and the potential to impact the environment. There's also programs, a series of 1 or more projects to be carried out concurrently or in phases, undertaken for a broad goal or purpose, and may include multiple sites or geographic areas. So the programmatic aspect is something that could really facilitate some of the things we do at Hawaiian Homelands. So I think we're looking into the possibility of doing that more, and I know that NAHASDA is as well, working on some of those programmatic approaches for environmental review. Okay, next slide. So evaluating for compliance, you need to evaluate if there's a primary or direct effect, a secondary or indirect effect. It can be caused by the action but is later in time or farther removed in distance, but reasonably foreseeable. So some of this is an art rather than a science. And if you ever have a question, just ask, because one has to do this for a number of years before it becomes second nature. So growth-inducing effect, a lot of times it has to do with patterns of land use, population density, traffic, impacts on air, water, or other natural systems. There can be cumulative effects, and they can result from individually minor but collectively significant actions taking place over a period of time. So there's a temporal aspect to this also. You have to look at build out. what are the impacts of this project? Not just, initially like phase one. So, okay, next slide. There are 13 significance criteria. Again, it's highlighted in orange that there were amendments made to 11 to include sea rise exposure area, relating to environmental sensitivity, and then 13, admitting substantial greenhouse gases. But these are the things that you have to go through when evaluating to see whether or not there's going to possibly be a significant impact on the environment. And when we actually take a final EA and FONSI to the commission, we have to go through all of these, and we have to basically document how they're not crossing that threshold of significance. And that's substantiated by the final EA. That's why the final EA needs to include all of the comments and responses, to requests for comments, and how the agency or the project proponent is going to be, responding to those comments, mitigating potential impacts. All that has to be documented, and then that's included when you go through all of these, evaluate all these criteria, the project against the criteria. Okay, next slide. We're getting there. Okay, so this is the big flow chart. This is ERP's flow chart. I think it's great. It's really helpful. It actually relates to the administrative rules. So there's citations all over the place, and it shows you, the decision points, various directions that things can go in. So I recommend, studying this to know more. And next slide. It's a lot of information. So it's kind of sectioned out. So Tom sectioned it out with, this is common processes. Most common to us are exemptions and environmental assessments. So this is the, this section here, these top two flow chart sections. And so that's normally what we do. If it's eligible for an exemption, we go with that. If it's de minimis, you can just send a list to ERP. If it's part two, is coming under part two, then it would actually be a full exemption that we would process. We have a bunch of paperwork that we do for that, and the chairman signs it, and then we would be sending that for publication in the environmental notice as well. So, and then if we can't exempt it, then we have to go to an EA, and that's the bottom in green there. So next slide. Okay, so this is our handy, and I didn't print this out, but this is a flow diagram of our internal Chapter 343 exemption process. And like I said, we're probably going to be updating the forms, and we may be updating this a little bit because I don't think we've updated it since the administrative rules were revised. So we might need to update this, and as soon as we have, we will send it out to everybody. But it's basically, we need that intake form, we need that complete project description, and then we can evaluate it against the exemption classes and specific exemption projects, that are listed, and and document all of that in our forms, and then we can let you know whether or not it can get eligible for an exemption. Okay, next slide. So again, this is that form, that intake form. If you can figure out what exemption class or type and number you think it might be eligible for, go ahead and include that. There might be additional ones. It might not quite fit that category, so we'll massage that. Please be as detailed as possible. Include plans if you have them. We need a map. We need to be able to locate it. especially if it's a big parcel. If it's only affecting a portion of the parcel, it's really helpful to know what portion of the parcel, how many acres, and everything on site and off. Just include everything. Don't hold back. It'll save time and it'll save back and forth. So, okay, next slide. Again, this is a description of, this is the next page, description of the surrounding environment. You know, if there's a DHHO lease or license number, include that. ROEs, if you can look up the island plan land use designation, you know, otherwise we'll do that. And then, you know, what are the existing conditions? It's really important to describe the existing conditions of the area, as well as neighboring parcels, what kinds of uses, and then finally, you know, what is the purpose of the project? If it's installing a water main, why is the water main required? Is it supporting new homesteads? So this identifies whether or not, you know, we're segmenting it, right? Because that causes problems. If you have to install the water line in order to develop new homesteads, we can't just review installing the water line. We also have to review, you know, the homesteads. We can't segment that if one is contingent on the other. Okay, next slide. Okay, so best case scenario, kind of outlined that here, you know, and I know that that Malia and Ku'upua, you know, talked about technical studies. Well, you know, identify those early on, especially for SHPD, right? You know, if you can get word that this is going to need an AIS, then, you know, get that as soon as possible, because that can take some time. Early consultation is an important step in the process. We really can't skip that. So what you're doing is you're reaching out with a brief project description to various agencies that, you know, might be concerned, whether it's county, state, federal, you know, and kind of get a heads up from them. What are the concerns they might have? What is the kind of information that they're going to want to see in a draft EA? And then you can make sure that that's included, because that can really save a lot of time. Then you prepare the draft EA. It goes to the planning office for review. We want to do beneficiary outreach if that's needed and desirable. We want to bring it pre-publication to the Hawaiian Homes Commission for their comment, if at all possible, and then file it with ERP, get it published in the environmental notice. If it's an EA, that's going to be a 30-day comment period. We've gone longer than that before. You really can't go shorter than that. And then we want, what sometimes can take a lot of time is coordinating responses to comments, because if agencies have substantive comments and additional studies that they want you to do, that's why the early consultation is so important, because that can identify that stuff, and then you can do that before you even get to the draft EA phase. But worst case scenario, it comes up later, then you're going to have to you know, coordinate those responses and figure out anything additional that needs to be done before you can publish the final EA, and hopefully get a FONSI from the Hawaiian Homes Commission. And then if we have to revise, we can, and we can publish the final EA in the environmental notice. Then after that, there's a 30-day legal challenge period. So we really technically can't start construction until that 30-day legal challenge period has expired. Okay, next slide. Okay, our exemption list. We've worked on this a lot. So previously, it hadn't been updated since the 1980s. I worked on it with others in the planning office. We updated it in 2015. Then we actually got another one. Malia worked on this, and she broke it up into part 1 and part 2. So she helped create all those de minimis items, and that was approved in 2021. But you know, it got really long. I mean, I think I printed it out here too. It's 24 pages long. So, that's a lot. So we kind of have revised that again. Cherie has been working on it. Aaliyah worked on it. And so we're trying to streamline it. So it went to the council, but they had a lot of comments. So right now we're working on, responding to their comments and making changes. And then so hopefully, I'd say, in the next few months, we're gonna, cross finger, be able to get this approved. And then we'll have an easy peasy, hopefully, much easier to use exemption list. And we'll make sure we send that information out to everybody. So, but it did, like I said, it broke it up into part 1 and part 2. And if you have a project that has actions from both parts of the exemption list, they'll get reviewed under part 2. So again, that's kind of similar to NEPA. And again, we need the intake form. So include all applicable exemption types, both part 1 and part 2. Okay, next slide. Okay, our current exemption list is on the ERP website. I think what we probably should think about doing is standing up a DHHL environmental review web page. We've talked about that for a while now. So I think kind of a one-stop location for folks to access stuff like our latest exemption list and other kinds of things. So hopefully we can work on that. So please use the one that's currently approved in 2021. And like I said, we started an update last year. So we're in the process of responding, and we'll let everybody know as soon as that's approved. So next slide. Okay, almost done. So one thing we've been doing, what we realized was that for DHHL projects, technically we can exercise what's called sovereign immunity, even if it's in the shoreline. And so, but we have to comply with Chapter 343 because of KPO v. Watson. So that means that when we do Chapter 343 and we do an EA, we are evaluating everything against HRS Chapter 205A, which is the Coastal Zone Management Law, identifying where the shoreline is, setbacks, erosion rates, all of that stuff is required now as part of Chapter 343. So, because that was also amended. So we are, Chapter 205A was amended, so it's requiring all this additional stuff. So again, it may involve surveying and locating the shoreline, calculating setbacks. So even if we're not going through if we choose to exercise that sovereign immunity and not go through the county's process, we are still complying with Chapter 205A. We're still evaluating the project against the coastal zone management goals, objectives, and guidelines, and basically demonstrating how the project will not be causing an environmental impact. If it does, then we're going to need to do an EIS. So sea level rise projections and coastal hazard exposure need to be analyzed. They need to be shown on maps. Okay, next slide. All right, so this is, again, courtesy of ERP. You can subscribe to the environmental notice. They will send you an email when it comes out. You can click on the link. You can look stuff up. You can check to make sure, if you have a document that was supposed to get published, that it got published, because a lot of times we rely on consultants to do this work for us, but we need to, check and make sure that it actually got published. There's additional materials, like I said, where the submittal form is really easy to use. You do need to have a shape file, though, that shows the location. So that's something that is kind of like a little extra thing that you need to get, and our consultants are really helpful with that sort of thing. And then if you have any questions, Tom has been really responsive and really helpful, especially when I call him or email him last minute in desperation. And, but I don't recommend that. They're a very small shop and they get extremely busy, especially at the time that the environmental notice is being published. So, they're trying to streamline things, but, send them an email. There's a web form, send them an email, and they'll respond to you as quickly as possible. And Tom has just been a really big help. So, okay, next slide. I think so questions about Hawaii's environmental review process, EAs, EISs, exemptions. And then one of the tricky things, and I didn't go into it because it's a lot and we can almost do a separate, workshop just on this, is doing HEPA and NEPA in the same document. So when they updated the rules, they did kind of flesh that out a lot more and provide guidance on how to do that, but it can still get tricky, especially when you've got compliance with Section 106 and Section 106 consultation, as well as HRS 6E compliance, how much consultation, and all of that. It can get really tricky. So I'm not an expert in it by any means, but if you're gonna want to do a joint HEPA NEPA document, make sure you've got the right technical assistance, and people are experienced with doing that before, because it can be challenging. It's supposed to help, but sometimes it's harder than it looks. So yeah, any questions?
Could I make one comment?
Yes, Tom, please.
I was at the recent Environmental Advisory Council meeting where they were considering the updated exemption list. And one of the issues that came up and kind of was demanding a lot of brain time was, well, recognition in HEPA, there's a distinction. There's basically two types of actions. An action can either be proposed by an agency or proposed by an applicant, which is anyone other than a state or county agency. And they were kind of trying to figure out what this relates in the context of the beneficiaries that might be proposing to do something. And because it's on state lands, it seemingly triggers HEPA. But in the case of applicant actions, there's a two-part test to meet to get into HEPA. There has to be a trigger, but there also has to be a discretionary consent. So both of those conditions have to be met for an applicant-based action to get into HEPA, and then have to get cleared by possibly an exemption or an EA or an EIS. But it seemed like there's probably a lot of times where a beneficiary is proposing something where it does not need a discretionary consent. It just might need a building permit or something. And there was this general consideration that in those scenarios, HEPA is not triggered. Well, a trigger is met, but they don't have to get, they're not in HEPA because they're not meeting that requirement of having a discretionary consent. Again, this is all in the case of applicants or non-agencies proposing something. So and there was kind of a lot of questions and discussions about that. And I think there was going to be further consideration of that, but it was a valid and interesting point that a lot of the things that beneficiaries, once they have their land and they're doing kind of day-to-day stuff, that it probably does not mean they have to get in and then clear chapter 343. So it's just a food for thought.
Oh, that was for like homestead lessees, because yeah, we also have, homestead and beneficiary organizations who propose, community use facilities, and, traditionally it's been, well, it's the use of state land. So,
yeah. So it's like, who is really proposing it, and are they truly an applicant, or is it like part of a bigger thing that the agency is really behind? But there's recognition that there's a distinction between whether the agency was proposing it or not as to how Chapter 343 applies. So there's room for attorneys to get involved on that one too.
Boy, yeah. Well, we'll definitely have to discuss that internally. Um, but I also think that when there is a discretionary approval, it comes from the Hawaiian Homes Commission.
Sure,
So
and
the
that
Hawaiian Homes Commission has to authorize, that lease or that license or that sort of thing.
right. So when there's the level of action that requires the commission to make a discretionary consent, then it's clear that they're going to be in HEPA because it's on state land and there's a discretionary consent. But in the case of maybe kind of minor activities where no discretionary consent is involved, and that's really the lynch point, is a discretionary consent involved as to whether they have to clear 343 or don't even have to deal with it.
All right, to be continued.
Always.
Any other questions? Anybody online? Okay. Russell.
So for apartment projects, residential side, planning office is the party that's doing the workup, right, for environmental, and it's the commission that is the approving agency, I take it from your presentation.
Well, I think, in some cases, other divisions are, running the project, so it might be LDD.
Okay, but it's the department that's doing the work, typically through a consultant.
Right.
With if you have a lease that is intended to generate revenue, and we're going to do a commercial lease, and we have a GL tenant, they still have to go through this process, but they're running the process and they're hiring the consultant to run through this process. And if that's the case, what is planning office or the department's role in that process? Do we sit on top of that and make sure it's done right, or is it kind of hands off until it gets to the commission and they make that determination? Or
well, I'm kind of trying to recall. That might be an Andrew question. I'm thinking of Kamakana Ali'i.
Yeah, that'd be a good example.
Yeah, and the environmental review that was done for that project, that was done through Land Management Division. But does anybody recall?
So typically, when we have general lessees who are for profit, and also with our community associations who are doing projects that are non-homesteading, it's their kuleana to fulfill 343. We treat them as the applicant. So I think Nancy and Tom went over applicant and approving agency. So our role is the approving agency. So we take a look at the applicant's 343 compliance documents and make a determination on whether or not to bring it forward to the commission if it's adequate enough for the commission's approval. So it's the general lessee's responsibility. For homestead lessees, the department, as much as possible, because that is our primary mission, is to try to take care of that compliance for homestead lessees. But for general lessees or community licensees, we usually put that responsibility on them.
And we really like it when the other divisions send us their draft EAs, so that we can take a look at them and make sure it's adequate. Anybody else? Just, you can always, send us an email, always ask. Like I said, Tom's always available. It's really important to get it right early on, because cleaning it up later on is a big bummer, can cost a lot of money. We don't want to go there. We want to get it right from the start.
Okay, I did want to add one caveat to that. So Nancy said, you know, she really wants to see the draft EA. She does, but she would prefer to be involved way before the draft EA comes into place. So don't wait for the draft EA. Like as soon as you know you're going to be doing the project, planning should be involved. So
Yeah,
I'm going to
thanks,
say
Malia.
this. Early cooperation is best.
Yeah, absolutely, because, you know, like the early consultation, or even before that, you know, because we can look stuff up pretty quickly online with GIS and basically say, whoa, 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 there's a huge wetland there, or whatever, you know. All right, mahalo, everybody. I think we're going to get out of here a little early today. Mahalo.
All right. Well, so I'm gonna say, since we don't, I'm willing to take any questions for any of the things that have come up in case something came up in the last hour or so. We can open that up really quickly for any of the sections, whether it was Ku'upua, Nancy, myself. I'll also answer for Claudine. I'll put her hat on a little bit. So I just want to offer that to anybody that's online in case they have questions, or anybody in the room. All right. Well, I want to thank everybody. Oh, we have one question. Hold on just a second.
I think I just wanted to make a quick comment about Kapa'akai framework analysis. So I just wanted to mention that often our process in DHHL, from what I've seen in the last year, is to kind of fold in Kapa'akai framework analysis, and that's specifically compliance with Article 12, Section 7 of the Hawaii State Constitution. So what I have seen is that that's folded into the environmental disclosure document. You might see that in the EA. We had a presentation in the fall to the commission and the Kauai meeting, where we talked more in depth about Kapa'akai analysis and how DHHL can ensure compliance with that. So it's in the same realm as NEPA and HEPA compliance, but it does have its own kind of specific formula. And that's something that you can look up kind of if you just Google Kapa'akai framework analysis. It has kind of 3 major components. And I think the presentation of it rolled in with an environmental assessment or environmental impact statement is not a problem, but it is a requirement for DHHL amongst other agencies and landowners for potential projects. So always something to just keep in mind. And that one is specific to Native rights and traditional and customary practices that may be impacted. And the major, it's pretty, like simple, the process. You want to understand what rights and practices are in the area, understand how they might be impacted, and include mitigation measures that kind of meaningfully protect. So that's something that I think agencies and organizations have struggled with, is the appropriate consultation that's needed in order to gather that information. Oftentimes you'll see it in a literature review, which is one way to gather some of the information, but active consultation with practitioners, lineal descendants, Kama'aina informants and whatnot is really the preferred method for ensuring full compliance. So just wanted to mention that. Mahalo.
Thank you very much, Lily. So next time we do this, we'll make sure that that is included as a section. So my apologies for not including that. Okay, do we have anything else? And Lily, I thank you very much for bringing that up. I apologize that we didn't include it. Okay, well then, it is 2:25. Thank you all very much for joining us today. Thank you so much, everybody that's online that joined. And we'll work to get the PowerPoint slides out to you today, and as soon as we've cut apart the recordings, we'll post those as well. If you are in person and you want the PowerPoint presentations, please make sure your email is on your on the sign-in sheet. And if you're DHHL, I can get it to you, no big deal. But other than that, thank you so much for all of your time. Mahalo.